Well, good morning, everyone. I know Charlie is going to give me the red card if I go too long, so let's get to this. Claudio Padua and I have been charged with offering some opening remarks about the Keystone concepts for the sessions today. That is to say, knowledge and governance. I think it's apropos that we're standing here in the midst of a planted, managed forest to talk about the future of a much larger, mostly natural, but increasingly perturbed forest in a very important part of the world. So thank you to Moore Foundation for making this possible, to the organizing committee for putting me up here to talk, and everybody who came from afar to be here today. I'm going to put on my academics hat a little bit in my own comments to talk about these key concepts here. Or we'll go here. Or here. If we can.
I guess you can't see.
Well, I'll talk X-Temp and you won't get to see pictures. But while we're working on this, so the point of departure for this morning is to recognize that a large chunk of the Amazon is in protected areas, as Carlos and Tom were talking about last night, of various kinds of protection. However, it's also obvious to everybody here that there's a large portion of the region that is also in the hands of various stakeholder groups, whether it's private property, whether it's concessions, whether we're talking about community or indigenous lands. And so there's a variety of different groups out there making decisions semi-independently of each other of what is going to happen. And so any effort to pursue conservation and development in the Amazon is going to have to find a way to engage those stakeholders, to seek common ground, find common interests in order to pursue conservation and development. So, okay, and that is what motivates our focus on one of the key terms for today, governance. Okay, governance, as many of you know, is any kind of collective decision-making process. Governance could be good or bad. It could be business as usual or quite intentional. What we have in mind here is a very intentional process, a designed process that is going to follow a particular set of procedures, including various stakeholders, to arrive at a planned outcome. In this case, more positive conservation and development outcomes. Okay? Structurally, then, governance implies a multi-stakeholder process, stakeholders who may be operating on very different scales, who may or may not previously know each other, and in many cases, if they do know each other, they may or may not have friendly relationships with each other. So there's a variety of complications that immediately arise and challenges that this approach poses as a means of engaging different stakeholders. Okay? Governance also implies a process. I would like to suggest that there's a cycle of activities. I'm going to give you my 5, but we could imagine another way to frame it. Okay, but where we begin by convening those stakeholders and figuring out who should be at the table and who should decide that. Okay, and so they can get to know each other. Where then we move into joint activities, where they're going to do things together involving planning, okay, for actions to achieve goals that they can achieve some common interest in establishing. And of course, that carries us into implementation, where local partners, governments, various other stakeholders are going to implement actions on those lands or watersheds, if you will, seeking the outcomes that we desire. But the process doesn't stop there, though. There's also a very important role for monitoring and evaluation. We need to know how well we're doing, and we need to know if we're not able to achieve the actions that we've intended. Okay, but then there's learning and adaptation that has to go on. And I think there's going to be a lot of that going on over the next couple of days. What have we learned? How can we do things better and differently? And the classic adaptive management paradigm, that could almost take us all the way back to the beginning of the cycle. Are the right stakeholders participating? Have we had established clear enough goals? Do we need to adjust our actions? And so on. Okay? So governance, at least in my experience, tends to be occur on a fairly local or a landscape scale, where you want to bring those stakeholders together. They can sit in the same room, okay, and talk to each other and do things together, okay. But that raises questions then about whether and how well we can achieve governance on larger scales, especially for a watershed of several million square kilometers, right? And so if you're going to pursue governance on a very large scale, it's often hard to include local actors. There's probably some upper limit to the number of people and organizations that can be represented in a governance process, especially if it's on a large scale, because we have to account for full participation on the classic ladder of participation such that everybody is empowered to make contributions. So there's some challenges there in governance, thinking about scale. But we would suggest that there are assets to governance, and the first one I think is especially important in the way we have framed the workshop over the next day or so. We want to suggest that governance can accommodate a variety of different kinds of tools and strategies for conservation and development, whether it is the establishment or strengthening of protected areas, whether it is the implementation of various kinds of market-based instruments, whether it's certification or PDS programs, or whether it's working with stakeholders to get them to adopt policy incentives offered by governments. We would suggest that the cycle, the structure that we've talked about, can accommodate these different kinds of tools. But there's other assets as well. Governance serves as a platform to bring people together, and merely getting people together is often important in itself because they're going to learn from each other. But it also allows people, it lends transparency as a result of that learning. People know what's going on, they know what the others think, okay? And that gives us a sense of legitimacy about the process that we're going to pursue. Right? And finally, going through that cycle, that experience in and of itself, okay, can offer a pathway. It offers a point of reference for stakeholders, especially if they haven't interacted with others, with their governments, with other firms, and so forth, okay? And it can create expectations about what ought to happen in the future, okay? It creates demand, and we've seen this in our own experience, which can make downstream initiatives more likely. It makes replication possible. It creates opportunities to scale up. And it makes other initiatives more feasible, whether led by locals or by outsiders. Right? And that brings us to the issue of management. Okay? Being an academic, worried about the production of knowledge, knowledge is a crucial input in every kind of governance process. On what basis are we going to make decisions? On what basis are we going to set our goals? What are the critical thresholds, as Carlos was talking about last night? We need to know these things in order to proceed. Okay? So if knowledge is at least one form of power, then sharing that knowledge and thus sharing that power can be empowering for everybody doing the sharing, regardless of what their knowledge fund looks like, okay? And then permits collaboration. Of course, collaboration makes things possible that otherwise might not be possible if you didn't have the right people in the room. What we're going to be into today are various tools and strategies for managing knowledge in governance. And those of you in the working groups who are coming later this morning know what we're talking about, okay? But there's a couple different modalities in what I mean when I say knowledge management. One, for the academics, the researchers out there, we're very involved in producing knowledge of. What do we know? Okay? But equally, there's also a very important role for the dissemination and especially the application of knowledge by other applied researchers and other stakeholders, what I would summarize as knowledge for. What are we going to do? It needs to be used for something. Okay? Both deserve investments. We talked last night and in Learning Day about what we know, but we recognize there's still some more things we need to better understand. But we can't wait until we know everything, right? We need to also make more effective use of what we already have. Okay, so this is part of the road going forward today. So with that, I want to put before us the Keystone Question to kind of organize the sessions after the keynote this morning, okay? You can see it up here, having to do with how can we better produce knowledge, how can we better share it, how can we better apply it, okay? All for the sake of supporting governance to address various and sundry drivers of deforestation to improve our conservation and development outcomes in the Amazon, to make them better, but also to make them bigger. So we're going to look ahead a little bit, give the teaser trailer of the sessions that you're going to be heading into shortly after the keynote this morning. We will have no less than 3 parallel sessions on different kinds of tools and strategies for using knowledge in governance. Okay? And so here's a little bit of the map, if you will. If you're in group 1, I forget what color that is, but you will be in the session on decision support tools, which will be out beyond the Learning Center outside this building, where we're going to have 3 working groups reporting back on what we know and what we need to be doing. The first group will be dealing with scientific analysis and simulation modeling, which has been a major role in linking science to policy making in the Amazon for many years. We need to take stock of what we have learned and how we can improve our practice there. We because if you can visualize your outcomes of models and you can specify the conditions under which different futures might occur, that can become an important basis for making decisions, including policies. We will also have a working group reporting back on indigenous peoples and their knowledge. And a key issue there is that indigenous groups have very deep temporal knowledge. They've been in the Amazon longer than anybody else, okay? And that range of experience and that range of past conditions can be very important in helping the rest of us think about what the Amazon in the future might look like and what we might anticipate here. And then finally, the third group in the first parallel session will be dealing with scenario planning, which not only allows us to address issues of uncertainty about the future, okay, but also provides a mechanism for incorporating stakeholder input from the beginning of any kind of planning process. And so it's a good moment to reflect on that and how that in turn can interact, how these different groups can learn from each other. The second of the three parallel sessions will take up issues of environmental monitoring as an important input into environmental management. So there'll be three groups here. The first of those will be dealing with multi-scalar data collection tools, okay? And there's a whole family of tools within that rubric, okay? Whether it has to do with field assessments, or as we already heard from Betty, the use of drones, and we'll have a demonstration about that later, or orbital platforms and other kinds of data that are collected on different scales and can be made, put to use in monitoring at different levels of scale as well. We're also going to hear from the working group on community monitoring and citizen science, which again is kind of a family of strategies and methods and practices that also incorporate local stakeholders and others in monitoring and thus knowledge management for governance. And then finally, we're going to have a group that's going to be dealing with what I'm summarizing as data curation, which might not sound that exciting, but we're swimming in lots of information, and it's out there on the web, and it's available, but people don't understand what the data mean, and there's not metadata, then how are the users actually going to take advantage of that information? So we have to pay attention to data curation, especially as the amount of information available continues to rise. And last but certainly not least, we're going to have a whole parallel session on this last step in the governance process on learning and adaptation, okay? One group is going to be reporting back to us to what we know about monitoring and evaluation. There's been a revolution in this. I've been on my own steep learning curve about how to understand how all this works. There's a whole set of tools in there about how to figure out if we're being successful, okay? Have we had the impacts that we anticipated? Are the actions and the strategies we're pursuing for C&D or conservation and development cost effective? Okay, they're going to be reporting back to us on this, and these methods really merit broader adoption across the community. Another group will be reporting back on what I'm summarizing as networks, okay? Very good at disseminating information on almost any scale now that we have phones and apps and the internet and all the rest, okay? But we need to learn some specific, take some specific lessons on some well-known networks that are already established in the Amazon on what they have achieved and how they can also improve their practice to guide the rest of us going forward. And then finally, participatory action research, which as with some of these other tools, is also a family or a constellation of different protocols and practices that seeks to explicitly, by design, integrate research activities side by side in the same time with knowledge application to, in effect, use knowledge more efficiently. Given that the clock is running on the Amazon, this is going to be an important initiative that I think we can all learn from. So we'll be learning from these groups. We'll be reflecting on what they have to say to us as we go forward as the day progresses. So let me conclude there by putting up the question for the day, just to remind us what we're here to do on day one by dealing with knowledge tools in governance for conservation. Thank you very much.